May 31st, 2017, the Didion Milling Dry Corn Mill in Cambria, Wisconsin. After an initial combustible dust explosion occurred within milling equipment, fires propagated inside of the process piping to other areas of the facility. Meanwhile, outside of the process, secondary explosions spread throughout the mill buildings, causing significant damage that ultimately destroyed the facility. 5 people died and 14 were injured.
The hazards of combustible dust are well known, and combustible dust explosions and fires can be deadly and incredibly destructive. The terrible tragedy at Didion was made even worse due to poor hazard recognition, inadequate fugitive dust management, and a lack of dust hazard analyses. Our investigation also determined that Didion had a poor safety culture and ineffective leadership on safety issues. These factors led to a catastrophic incident that could have been prevented.
Didion Milling is an agricultural processing company with several facilities based in Wisconsin. At Didion's dry corn mill, located in Cambria, Wisconsin, corn kernels were ground into smaller components for use in a variety of corn-based products. The process of grinding corn kernels produces corn-based products and dust. Both the product and dust can be combustible. They can present flash fire or explosion hazards when dispersed in sufficient concentrations and ignited in air. Also, when product or dust accumulates in process equipment, it may, under certain circumstances, begin to smolder, leading to what is called a smoldering nest. Smoldering nests can rapidly transition to a flash fire or explosion if the smoldering material is disturbed. Therefore, finely ground corn products and dust present serious hazards that must be understood and carefully managed. On May 31st, 2017, shortly after 10:30 p.m., multiple employees at the Didion Mill facility noticed an unusual smell or saw smoke. Several employees searched the facility, trying to pinpoint the source of the smoke. They determined that it was likely coming from the first floor of one of the mill's buildings, known as B Mill, but could not pinpoint the precise location. The CSB determined that the smoke was likely coming from a smoldering nest located inside the corn grinding process. 2 employees on the first floor of B Mill had been searching for the source of the smoke for about 20 minutes when they heard a huge boom. An explosion had occurred within the process equipment. Immediately thereafter, flames erupted from piping connected to one of the 2 gap mills on the first floor. At the same time, the employees saw dust misting down from overhead piping. Recognizing that the overhead dust cloud was likely to ignite, both employees raced to escape. One of the employees made an evacuation announcement on one radio channel, but did not have time to make the announcement on all radio channels. Before he could alert others to the danger, a larger secondary explosion occurred on the first floor. The destruction at Didion was now set on 2 tracks. Inside of the process, a pressure wave from the initial explosion dispersed accumulated product and dust. This provided fuel for a flame front that propagated inside piping and equipment within B Mill from the first floor to the floors overhead. The flame front ultimately propagated to a large dust collector called the dry grit filter, which was located outside of the building. Once the fire reached the dry grit filter, the equipment overpressurized and released a fireball, which engulfed one of the evacuating employees. From the dry grit filter, the flame front was able to propagate inside the process through piping and equipment into the mill's other buildings. Outside of the process, the fire from the initial explosion combined with combustible dust from disconnected process lines and fugitive dust dislodged from overhead surfaces, and began a series of secondary explosions throughout the facility. The explosions caused multiple buildings to collapse and ultimately destroyed the facility. 19 employees were working at the dry corn mill at the time of the incident. All of those employees were injured, 5 of them fatally.
The U.S. Chemical Safety Board launched an investigation into the incident at Didion Milling and found 13 safety issues. Among these were process hazard recognition, dust hazard analyses, fugitive dust management, process safety leadership, and regulatory coverage of combustible dust.
One safety issue is process hazard recognition. During its investigation, the CSB found that many of Didion's ground corn products were of a small enough particle size to themselves be combustible dusts. In fact, every material that the CSB tested, including final products, as well as other materials found in Didion's processes, qualified as combustible dust. Despite previous warnings from external inspections, the CSB found no evidence that Didion understood or recognized the hazards of combustible dust. As a result, the company did not recognize that many of its products and process streams presented combustible dust hazards. For example, in addition to other design flaws found in the mill, the company did not recognize that connecting numerous pieces of equipment through the same dust collection system could lead to a flame propagating throughout the facility.
Had Didion limited the process equipment interconnections at the mill facility, the initial dust explosion could not have propagated throughout the process equipment so easily. Instead, a flame front reached the dry grit filter and then propagated to other previously uninvolved parts of Didion's processes. This allowed damage to spread to processes and buildings that otherwise likely would not have been involved in the incident.
A second safety issue found by the CSB concerns dust hazard analysis. Dust hazard analyses, or DHAs, are assessments of processes to determine potential combustible dust hazards, and are outlined by guidance from the National Fire Protection Association, or NFPA. DHAs are used to identify engineering controls needed to maintain safe operations during normal and upset conditions. While the NFPA guidance was published in 2015, by the time the incident occurred in 2017, Didion had not performed any analyses of the grain handling processes for potential fire and explosion hazards. And the CSB found that the NFPA guidance did not cover all equipment that could have the potential for combustible dust hazards.
Even if Didion had performed a timely DHA, the company could have still potentially missed the fire and explosion hazards in the equipment where the smoldering nest and first explosion likely occurred. Therefore, the CSB believes the NFPA guidance must be improved.
As a result, the CSB made a recommendation to the National Fire Protection Association to update its guidance to unify the requirements for performing dust hazard analyses, to remove equipment exemptions, and require the assessment of all processes. In response, the NFPA has published a new comprehensive combustible dust standard, NFPA 660, that addresses this recommendation. A third safety issue identified by the CSB is fugitive dust management. Fugitive dust presents a serious safety hazard because it can accumulate within facilities and provide fuel for secondary explosions that an initial fire or explosion can shake loose and ignite. At Didion, the large secondary explosions that occurred outside of the process and accounted for significant building damage and employee injuries were at least partly fueled by fugitive dust. This is why housekeeping or cleaning practices meant to manage fugitive dust are critical. They minimize the fuel available for secondary explosions. To be effective, housekeeping must be done consistently and leave no unmonitored areas for dust to accumulate. But the CSB found that at Didion, the control of fugitive dust fell under the site's master sanitation program. The sanitation program, however, was based on food safety standards, intended to reduce hazards like pathogens and contaminants. It was not based on workplace standards meant to minimize process hazards like those presented by combustible dust. As a result, Didion's master sanitation program did not require maintenance of areas at the facility that could present combustible dust hazards, but not food safety hazards, such as the dust collectors or their associated ductwork. Additionally, cleaning or periodic inspections in hidden overhead or limited access areas that could harbor combustible dust accumulations never occurred.
Companies should ensure that the standards they are using are applicable and appropriate to the hazards inside the facility. Food safety standards are appropriate for preventing food hazards, such as pathogens and contaminants, from reaching consumers, but they are not intended to address workplace or process hazards, such as combustible dust. Appropriate tools, such as dust hazard analyses, should be used to address process hazards like combustible dust.
A fourth safety issue at Didion is a lack of process safety leadership. In its investigation, the CSB found that Didion exhibited weak process safety leadership. The CSB found that in the 5 years leading up to the incident, there were multiple smoldering fires and process upsets. Didion treated these conditions as normal, which caused employees to not recognize the significance of the smoldering fire on the day of the incident and the potential for it to transition to a catastrophic dust explosion.
Because of inadequate process safety leadership, Didion had a poor safety culture and weak safety programs. Although the facility clearly exhibited industry-recognized combustible dust hazards, Didion's leadership did not respond adequately, allowing an explosion that caused injuries and fatalities.
As a result, the CSB recommended that Didion develop and implement a process safety leadership and culture program and develop a comprehensive combustible dust process safety management system. Finally, a fifth safety issue that contributed to the incident at Didion is regulatory coverage of combustible dust. The Occupational Safety and Health Administration, or OSHA, outlines regulations for combustible dust hazard management for the grain industry in its Grain Handling Facilities Standard. Didion was covered by OSHA's Grain Handling Facilities Standard. However, this standard does not incorporate safety management systems, such as incident investigations, management of change, and dust hazard analysis. And there are many other industries, such as food, agriculture, and polymers, that present the hazard of combustible dust, but are not subject to a comprehensive regulatory standard to address the hazard.
Since 2006, the CSB has called on OSHA to develop an overarching standard on combustible dust for general industry. But despite these repeated calls, OSHA has yet to act on the CSB's recommendations.
Therefore, in its report, the CSB once again recommended that OSHA promulgate a standard for all industries that handle combustible dust. The standard should, at a minimum, require elements such as hazard recognition, dust hazard analysis, and fugitive dust management, among others.
The CSB has been calling for a comprehensive standard on combustible dust for many years. Robust regulation is absolutely essential to keep tragic incidents like the one at Didion from happening again. But in the meantime, any facility that handles combustible dust should read our report and take action to apply the lessons learned at Didion. Doing so can prevent another deadly incident. Thank you for watching this CSB safety video.
For more information, please visit csb.gov.